Hello and welcome to the Yesterday's Airlines hangar. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at one of my airline model fleets, and that is going to be Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am. So Pan Am is obviously a major component of my US fleet, and it is stored, as you might be able to see in the far distance, at the very top of one of these glass cabinets, which you can see as I walk towards it, gradually see the Pan Am globe coming into focus. Now, Pan Am is obviously, or was obviously, the primary international airline of the United States for a long time until its bankruptcy in 1991, although the 1980s weren't good to Pan Am, and its fleet and network had drastically reduced before its final closure. A Pan American in 400 scale is an airline which has had quite a lot of releases, but many of them are very hard to find because they were made either early in the 400 scale age on molds which are now very highly sought after, or they've been made in very small numbers. And this is partly because of licensing, and Pan Am is one of the airlines, or the people who own the Pan Am trademark is one of the companies that cares about licensing a bit more than others, and so some of the manufacturers have gotten around this. I think Gemini has a license to make Pan Am models, but it does mean there are perhaps less Pan Am models made than there might be otherwise. So in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Pan Am fleet that you can see here in a bit closer detail, and look at the different models that I own, which take you through Pan Am from the immediate post-war era up to the airline's closure in the early 90s. So I'll start this look at the Pan Am fleet over on the left of the collection, which contains the oldest models. You can obviously see some 747s in the background, but it's difficult to fit 747s in, so that's why they are there. But if we move over to the far left, you can see that we have a selection of prop liners, initially wearing the silver-topped scheme from the late 1940s, and most of these are made by Aero Classics, or what was called Pan Am Models Company. I think it's probably just a front organisation of ACs, and you can see that we've got a variety of classic prop piston liners here. There's a Douglas DC-3, there's a Convair 240, there's a Curtiss C-46 Commando, and a couple of early Lockheed Constellations. So the four on the left in silver are all Pan Am models or Aero Classics, and at the back you can see there is a Dragon Wings Constellation, which is the other way around because it tail sits awfully if it's not. Now moving back to the front, then in the early 50s, as with most US carriers, the silver top was replaced by a white finish, and so we've got another Pan Am Models Convair wearing that scheme, and behind it a more recent Aero Classics DC-6. If we move further back, then there's another Constellation, and obviously one of the iconic aircraft that Pan Am operated was the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. Now, as the 1950s gave way to the 60s, Pan Am introduced its globe livery. I think it was in 59 or early 60, and here it is visible on a couple of the piston liners that wore it. We've got a C-54 cargo aircraft, and even some of the Stratocruisers did get into this scheme just before their retirement. Now behind them, you can see the aircraft that really was the primary replacement for the Stratocruiser. There's a real lack of early 707s in 400 scale, so this is actually a 707 turbofan variant, not one of the early Series 100s, and not one of the early what were called 707 Intercontinentals at the time. And in front of that there's also a DC-7C, which has been by this point relegated to cargo duties. And moving back towards the front, an early DC-8 turbojet, because Pan Am initially ordered both the DC-8 and the 707 and operated DC-8s for a reasonable period of time. Most of them are gone by the end of the 60s though. Behind that is another DC-8, and this one's unique. It's not actually even a Pan Am aircraft as of such. It's a Braniff aircraft that was used on one of the interchange agreements and was painted in Pan Am colours. And ahead of that, an aircraft which is definitely Pan American, an early 727-100, and that's a geminijets model. Most of the models here are Aero Classics. I'll only point out the ones that aren't, and that one's, as I said, Gemini. Now, as the 60s came towards their conclusion, Pan Am was going great guns, and this is perhaps where it started getting itself into trouble. It started spending money on aircraft, giant aircraft, and fast aircraft. Pan Am did order Concords, and here we've got a Dragonwings example. They actually, some of these Pan Am aircraft actually got built, but never obviously delivered to Pan Am or painted in Pan Am colours, so that's a fantasy model. And of course, the aircraft that's synonymous with Pan American is the Boeing 747, of which Pan Am operated a large number of 100s, bought way too many, cost them way too much money, started getting them in a lot of debt, and when the 70s oil crisis hit, Pan Am, like a lot of airlines, struggled. But here's an early Pan Am. This is Dragonwings, Clipper Victor. It's the aircraft actually destroyed at Tenerife, but we're in the earliest scheme with the small titles and the straight flag. But Pan Am in the mid-70s did change its scheme, and the primary changes can be seen on this aircraft here, which is, I think, made by Apollo. And those changes were larger titles and a change to the flag, which is now looking more flowing. It's been slanted. As you see, there's also a cargo variant of 747. Pan Am converted quite a few 747s to cargo operations. And the new Pan Am scheme, which I think was introduced in 1976, was applied to a variety of the rest of their fleet. Here we've got, I'll just get the camera focus, sorry, there we go. Another 727-100, this time Aero Classics, and a 707 as well. And behind the aircraft that I think introduced that updated livery with the slanted flag, the 747 SP, and this one is the very recent ngmodels release. Pan Am also operated some cargo 707s, and here's another one, and acquired long body 727-200s. And this one is a Gemini. Okay, so what else have we got here? Now, before we move on to the billboard scheme, let's just take a look at this column here of models. Here we've got three aircraft tell a different story. The first two, the 727 and the DC-10, both came from the ill-fated merger with National Airlines. That was a disaster for Pan Am, just as it was beginning to get itself back together. The two airlines didn't mix well, and it was financially a complete nightmare. Behind them is an aircraft which Pan Am perhaps shouldn't have bought. TriStar 500. Maybe they should have just stuck with more 747 SPs. Having said that, it's a lovely model, and this one is by NG again. There's obviously various variants of these models around. Some of them, sorry, the camera's not focusing well, is it? Some of them are better than others. The geminijets version of this model is really, there we go, is really very poor. This ngmodels version is really, 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 really impressive. So even though Pan Am's fortunes were ebbing, they were still acquiring new aircraft, but they did have a huge fleet of old 747s, and Pan Am into the early 80s began experimenting with changing their scheme, and these 747s here, which are both, I think they're either Big Bird or Aero Classics, I can't remember. They are showing two of the scheme variants that Pan Am trialled, but obviously Pan Am did not go with either of these. It instead went with a fresh and different billboard scheme, which we can see here on a portion of the newer and the last fleet that Pan Am operated. Before we get to that, I'll just touch on the aircraft at the front. Again, we've got another 727-200, another ex-national bird, and we've got a couple of 737-200s here as well. Pan Am acquired quite a few of these for routes in Germany. And if we move to the back again, then we've got this silver Pan Am cargo freighter. So onto the billboard scheme. Oh, but there's also another national DC-10 there. Onto the billboard scheme, and you can see that it was worn by Pan Am's new Airbuses, an attempt to operate smaller aircraft than the 747s, both of those Aero Classics, and got onto 727s as well, which are still being seen in Europe well into the 80s. That 727 is actually made by Apollo. Again, the 747 is, I think, either Aero Classics or Big Bird. And down here we've got the Herpa SP, which will presumably be replaced reasonably soon by an NG version. And the last model, which we can see over here, is this lovely little ATR operated by the Pan Am Express. So Pan Am, obviously by this point, was running out of cash, running out of money. It sold a lot of assets and could not survive outside or into 1992. But the airline has left obviously a wonderful heritage of schemes. It's left an amazing and interesting and varied history, which really is super impressive, and obviously an airline with a huge number of characters, like one trip, and the various people that were forced to take over after he left and struggled to try and get the airline back on track before its demise. So that is a quick look around my Pan American fleet. I hope you've enjoyed that video. It's a really good airline to collect, but it is a tough one to get the models for, I admit. So good luck collecting your own Pan Am aircraft, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing my version of the fleet. Thanks very much for watching. That's it for this video. I'll see you later.